The camera lingers on a black and white photograph. A family stands in front of a small wooden house. The father wears a neatly pressed suit, his arm around his wife, who clutches her handbag close to her chest. Their children stand barefoot on the porch steps, eyes wide, uncertain. The year is 1950, and behind this image lies an entire world, one of quiet resilience, unseen struggle, and unshakable dignity in the face of America's unspoken truth. The 1950s in America are often remembered as a time of booming prosperity. The suburbs expanded, televisions flickered into living rooms, and the so-called American dream took root. But for black families, that dream was often kept just beyond reach, carefully guarded by invisible walls of law, custom, and violence. Life was lived in the shadows of promises never fully delivered. To be black in the 1950s was to inhabit two Americas at once, one that praised freedom and opportunity, and another that denied those very things based on the color of your skin. In cities like Chicago and Detroit, black workers had helped build the engines of American industry during World War II, filling factories, shipyards, and steel mills. They returned from the war with pride, with medals pinned to their uniforms, believing that service to their country might finally bridge the deep chasm of racial injustice. But coming home meant stepping back into a society that still called them boy, that forced them into segregated neighborhoods, that handed them broom handles instead of promotions. They could fight for democracy overseas, yet be denied a simple vote in their own hometowns. On hot southern nights, the weight of Jim Crow pressed down like thick humidity. Signs dictated which fountains could be used, which diners would serve you, which doors you were allowed to walk through. A black mother traveling with her children packed sandwiches in wax paper because restaurants would not open their doors. Families kept the Negro Motorist Green Book in the glove compartment, not as a guide to explore, but as a lifeline, a catalog of safe havens in a land where danger could erupt at a gas station, a hotel desk, or a roadside diner. And yet, within those boundaries, black communities built worlds of their own. Churches stood as sanctuaries where the weary found strength and sermons turned into calls for courage. Sunday mornings rang with gospel choirs whose voices reached higher than the walls of segregation. In kitchens, the smell of cornbread and collard greens carried laughter, stories and songs passed down through generations. On front porches, neighbors gathered to talk, to play checkers, to swap news, keeping alive the bonds of humanity that oppression tried to fracture. But the dignity of daily life did not erase the sharp sting of injustice. In Montgomery, Alabama, a seamstress named Rosa Parks boarded a city bus one December evening in 1955. Her refusal to stand her quiet decision to stay seated in a space she was told she could not occupy ignited something that had been smoldering for decades. That moment, small and ordinary on its surface, became the spark that lit a fire across the South. The Montgomery bus boycott was more than a protest. It was a declaration that black life was not to be dismissed or diminished. For 381 days, men, women, and children walked miles to work, organized carpools, and endured threats, all to demand the simple right to sit with dignity. Behind every headline, though, were untold stories of ordinary people navigating extraordinary constraints. A father working 2 jobs to pay the rent, though his wages were half that of his white co-worker. A mother sewing late into the night, her fingers raw, to buy her child a second-hand school book. A teenager dreaming of college, only to find doors slammed shut by laws that called her ambition misplaced. These were not just struggles, they were testaments of resilience, of people insisting on their humanity in a nation that often refused to see it. The 1950s were also a time when violence loomed like a storm cloud. In Mississippi, a 14-year-old boy named Emmett Till laughed, lived, and dreamed like any child should. But in the summer of 1955, a trip to visit relatives ended in horror. His brutal lynching shocked the conscience of the nation. When his mother, Mamie Till Mobley, insisted on an open casket, she forced America to look at what it preferred to hide. Thousands filed past his coffin in Chicago, their eyes wet with grief and rage. The photograph of his disfigured face was carried into newspapers, classrooms, and hearts. That boy's stolen life became a rallying cry, awakening a movement that could no longer be ignored. Still, there were moments of joy, even triumph. On ball fields and basketball courts, black athletes broke barriers and challenged stereotypes. Jackie Robinson had already stepped onto the diamond, his presence a challenge to every jeer and thrown bottle. By the 1950s, his stolen bases and fearless spirit made him more than a player, he was a symbol of possibility. In the smoky clubs of Harlem and New Orleans, jazz and blues told stories in ways words could not. Miles Davis, Ella Fitzgerald, Ray Charles, these voices sang not only of struggle but of beauty, hope, and an unstoppable creativity born from pain. At kitchen tables, debates stirred among parents and their children. Some urged patience. Change will come, but we must endure. Others whispered of new leaders rising, of marches and sit-ins, of a different kind of future that might finally bend the arc of justice. The words of a young preacher in Montgomery, Martin Luther King Jr., began to spread, his sermons weaving scripture and justice into a fabric strong enough to carry millions. Life for Black Americans in the 1950s was not a single story, but a chorus of them songs of grief, laughter, rage, endurance, and faith. Each story carried the weight of centuries, yet also the flicker of something unbroken. Beneath the rules that sought to contain them, Black people nurtured an unwavering belief. That dignity was not granted by law, but carried in the heart. That freedom was not a favor to be given, but a birthright to be claimed. The decade closed with a nation uneasy, caught between its polished image of prosperity and the undeniable cracks beneath the surface. For Black Americans, the 1950s were a proving ground of spirit. Every step taken to a segregated water fountain, every paycheck cut short, every prayer whispered in the pews was a reminder that the fight was not just for survival, it was for recognition, for respect, for the simple truth that their lives mattered. This was the reality of Black life in the 1950s. To wake each morning in a country that promised liberty, while denying it at every turn. To endure humiliation while holding on to pride. To live with injustice, yet continue to dream. And as the decade turned, those dreams began to move from whispers to shouts, from private grief to public action. The seeds of revolution had been planted. The turn of the decade carried with it a strange tension, like the silence before a storm. In the late 1950s, the country stood at a crossroads. For white America, television showed tidy suburban lawns and cheerful housewives preparing dinner. But for Black America, those same screens became windows into a different possibility. Glimpses of leaders speaking boldly, of communities refusing to bow down, of a future that might be carved by courage rather than compliance. The streets of Little Rock, Arkansas, told one of the most searing stories of that moment. In 1957, 9 Black teenagers, ordinary students with ordinary dreams, walked toward Central High School, knowing the world was watching. They faced crowds that hurled insults like stones, faces twisted with rage at the idea that education could be equal. Soldiers with bayonets escorted them, not to protect their learning, but to protect their lives. Every step through those school doors was more than a walk to class, it was an act of defiance, a demand for belonging in a country that tried to write them out of its future. These young people were not politicians or seasoned activists. They were simply children, carrying textbooks heavier than their years, carrying also the burden of generations. Their courage cracked open the carefully polished facade of America's image, forcing the nation to confront its contradictions. For every camera that captured their steps, millions at home had to face the truth. The pursuit of equality was not some distant idea. It was happening in real time, in the faces of children who wanted nothing more radical than an education. But beyond the public battles, every day, Black life still carried the weight of quiet struggle. In small southern towns, Black farmers tilled the soil with hands hardened by labor, often watching white landowners profit from their sweat. In northern cities, neighborhoods grew crowded as families migrated in search of work, only to be met with redlined maps and housing covenants that penned them into narrow blocks. Banks refused loans, real estate agents turned them away, and police patrolled with suspicion instead of protection. And yet, within those neighborhoods, life pulsed with energy. Barber shops buzzed with debates about politics, baseball scores, and church news. Beauty salons doubled as meeting halls, where women discussed strategy for upcoming rallies and exchanged whispered encouragement. Jukeboxes in corner cafes played the latest rhythm and blues, their notes spilling into the streets, carrying joy even when paychecks were thin and futures uncertain. Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier delivered more than headlines, they delivered hope. Their pages told stories of progress, uplifted voices that mainstream presses ignored, and called out injustices with a courage that others avoided. For readers flipping through their pages, each word was a reminder. We are seen, we are heard. We are part of this nation, but change, though fragile, was stirring. Courtrooms began to echo with cases that chipped away at segregation's foundations. Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 declared that separate schools were not equal, shattering the legal pillars of Jim Crow. Though the ruling faced fierce resistance, it planted a truth in the American conscience that could not be unlearned. In living rooms, black parents sat their children down and spoke plainly. You are as good as anyone. Don't let them tell you otherwise. These were not just words of comfort, they were instructions for survival. To walk into segregated schools, to sit at lunch counters where waitresses refused to serve you, to face down police officers who could strip dignity with a single gesture, required a kind of bravery that went unrecorded but was lived every day. Church pews became training grounds for that bravery. Ministers spoke of Moses and Pharaoh, of crossing into promised lands, weaving biblical stories into blueprints for liberation. Choirs lifted their voices, not only in worship but in resistance, turning hymns into battle songs. In basements after Sunday service, plans were drawn for boycotts, sit-ins, and marches. It was here that ordinary men and women transformed into foot soldiers of the movement, armed not with guns but with conviction. The 1950s were also marked by the pain of what could not yet be achieved. For every legal victory there were setbacks written in blood. Lynching still haunted Southern soil, unpunished and unspoken by courts. Police brutality left scars both visible and invisible. Black veterans who wore their uniforms with pride often returned to find themselves denied jobs, denied respect, denied even the right to walk safely down certain streets. And yet, despite the bruises of injustice, there was an insistence on joy. Families gathered around radios on Friday nights to hear the laughter of new black comedians breaking through the static. Children chased fireflies in backyards, their giggles momentarily louder than the world's cruelty. Couples danced in crowded ballrooms, the horn of a saxophone cutting through the night, reminding everyone that beauty could still be created even in harshest soil. By the close of the decade, something undeniable had taken root. Black Americans, long silenced, were finding a collective voice that could no longer be ignored. From Montgomery to Little Rock, from Harlem to Birmingham, stories of courage echoed across the nation. These stories were not simply about discrimination, they were about defiance, dignity, and the refusal to be erased. It is easy, in hindsight, to view the 1950s as a prelude to the great upheavals of the 1960s, but to those who lived it, it was not prelude, it was the struggle itself. It was mothers holding their sons tighter at night, fathers teaching daughters to look straight ahead no matter the insults, communities organizing quietly under the gaze of hostile eyes. It was a decade where every small act, sitting on a bus seat, walking into a school, registering to vote, was in itself revolutionary. The 1950s were not only about the oppression Black Americans endured, they were about the strength with which they endured it. They were about carving dignity from indignity, finding light in the cracks of a darkened system, and preparing the ground for a movement that would soon shake the very foundations of the nation. As the decade faded, one could almost hear the gathering roar of a new era. The quiet determination of the 1950s would swell into the march of the 1960s. The whispered prayers in church pews would become chants on courthouse steps. The children who endured spit and slurs walking into Central High would grow into leaders. And the grief of mothers like Emmett Till would transform into a demand so powerful that the nation could not look away. To understand Black life in the 1950s is to understand both the pain and the promise of America. It is to see the distance between the nation's ideals and its reality, and to witness how ordinary people, through faith, persistence, and sheer human will, close that distance step by step. The decade ended not with resolution but with determination. The road ahead was long, and the fight was far from over. But for every injustice, there had been resistance. For every wound, there had been healing through community. For every attempt to diminish Black life, there had been an unshakable assertion: we are here, we matter, and we will not be moved. This was the story of the 1950s, a story of struggle, yes, but also of strength. A story of a people who, in the face of relentless barriers, chose not despair but dignity. And it was this dignity, carried quietly through daily life, that would soon erupt into a movement powerful enough to bend the course of American history itself.